Some of you might have heard that I was recently appointed to join the Public Debt Audit Committee. However, after a thorough examination of the legal framework, something that I did with great enthusiasm, I assure you that I had to politely decline the invitation. And why do you ask? This is a question that I receive on several occasions, and I said, since I'm here, I'll answer it before you ask. Well, simply put, it was a case of putting the cart before the horse. The committee, as was constituted, was unconstitutional. And I stand vindicated because the courts have put that to a stop to date. However, this does not mean that we should not vet the public debt, that we should not ask hard questions, we should not demand accountability and transparency of how our monies are being used. You see, the Constitution is not just a piece of paper that we pull out to wave during election cycles or when we want to sound important. It is the supreme law of the land, the anchor that holds us steady amidst the political and economic tempests that blow through this nation. If we disregard it when it's inconvenient, we might as well be setting sail without a compass in a stormy sea. And that, my dear friends, is a recipe for disaster, much like our current fiscal policy, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. And I want to say this as well, because if we remember, there was one meeting that the former Chief Justice, Willie Mutunga, attended, and he raised concern as he looked at the new cabinet secretaries that had since been appointed that were attending the NCAJ meeting. And he raised concern that the previous president, then Uhuru Kenyatta, refused to obey court orders. And it's a trajectory that he continued to ignore court orders, irrespective of him being reminded, the courts asserting themselves, he continued to disobey those court orders. Little did he know, the moment he ceased to be the head of state, the same state that he thought was supreme came to his doors. And he was at the courts trying to save his son. And so these same courts, this same constitution, should not be treated as a piece of paper. Because even those who deem to try to ignore the Constitution, deem to try to ignore the laws of this nation, when they step down from the tenets of power or cede to hold power, they'll be rushing those courts to protect them as well. So this is a message that needs to ring clear to those who perceive that they're in power, because power changes. And the unfortunate thing is that the face of government never changes. So if you think that when you cease to hold those positions of power that they will remember you were once an important person, life will teach you otherwise. We find ourselves at a critical juncture in our nation's history, where the Law Society of Kenya must and has indeed stepped up to guide both the government and the public in legally addressing the complex public debt crisis we are facing. Public debt, in essence, is a binding commitment, a promise made by the government to borrow today with a pledge to repay the future. However, this commitment is not merely an agreement between the government and its creditors. It's a pact between the current generation and those that will follow. This pact imposes significant legal and moral obligations on the government, obligations that profoundly affect our innocent children. Kenya is not deficient in legal frameworks for managing public debt. Our constitution's draft has laid out a clear guidelines, and our public finance laws specify what is required. So why have we arrived at this precarious situation? Was there a breach of these laws that led us here? Before we can chart a path forward, we must first untangle the events that brought us to this moment. No matter how difficult or revealing that process may be, it is crucial to remember that the Constitution and the public finance laws are the tools through which the people empower the government to act on their behalf. When the government borrows, it does so with the expectation that these actions are in the best interest of the nation, and not just for the present, but for the long term. When public debt spirals out of control, as we are witnessing today, the trust placed in the government is broken. Excessive debt hinders the state's ability to perform its essential functions, such as providing education, healthcare, ensuring economic stability, and protecting the vulnerable. When debt is mishandled, it undermines the very foundation of our social contract. This is where the law must intervene, not just to regulate, but to safeguard, ensuring public borrowing is carried out with transparency, accountability, and a strong sense of justice. As we gather here today, it is clear that we are not merely lamenting our woes, we are strategizing, we are planning, we are making a stand. Public debt, when responsibly managed, can be a tool for development. But in Kenya, it has been akin to giving a teenager a credit card with no spending limit, an experiment that rarely ends well. Our public debt has ballooned over the past decade at an alarming rate. It has grown so large that at this point, it might as well have that we have a problem. We must be willing to confront it, to hold those responsible to account, to push for reforms that will prevent this from happening again. This is where the Law Society of Kenya stands firm. We are not just lawyers in black robes shuffling papers in courtrooms. We are defenders of the Constitution, advocates for justice, and where necessary, the thorn in the side of those who seek to trample at the rights of Kenyans. This assembly is a critical step in our collective journey towards fiscal responsibility and public accountability. It's a platform where voices from all walks of life, civil society, government, the private sector, and everyday Kenyan can come together to find solutions. We must ask ourselves tough questions. How did we get there? What mechanisms failed? Who benefited from this unsustainable debt, and who is paying the price? And most importantly, how do we prevent this from happening? I say sometimes that as we discuss this debt question, we are not talking about the debt bonds that we have taken. The first bond issue. How much did we take? Where is the contract? Have we been able to see it? How much was spent in the country? And which projects can we identify? And then the second bond. And then let's talk about who helped in fundraising for that bond. Because these international organizations have law that bind them in their countries, that also frown upon corruption, and not the kind of frowning in our country where your matter can be resolved after some time. In those countries, the matters cannot be resolved. You'll be held accountable. So let's start from the first bond issue. Let's have a clear discussion. Where did that money go? Can we identify those projects? Who are involved? Where is our first Auditor General? I remember once that he had a discussion that he wanted to audit the first debt that was called for the country. And that didn't end well at that particular time. But if there's a time to call him at the table and have that discussion, the time is now. The answers, I believe, lie in a combination of prudent economic management, robust legal frameworks, and an active, informed citizenry. We must ensure that our public finance management systems are not just theoretically sound, but practically effective. We must push for transparency in all financial dealings and demand that those who mismanage or misuse public funds are held accountable. And we must engage every Kenyan in this process, because at the end of the day, it is the ordinary citizens who bear the brunt of corruption and mismanagement. I'm reminded of a story as a young lawyer that a client came to me when which he described as a small financial issue. And as our discussions proceeded, this small financial issue involved a mountain of debt accumulated through a series of bad decisions and poor advice. And when I asked him, why did he come earlier? Why didn't he seek legal advice earlier? And he replied that he thought it wasn't a big deal until it was too late. Kenya is that client today. We cannot afford to wait until it's too late to address our debt crisis. We must act now with urgency and resolve. The Debt and Anti-Corruption Citizen Assembly is a critical part of that action. and I commend TISA, the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, and all partners involved for their tireless efforts. As we seek solutions, I propose the following measures on our part as advocates. A comprehensive public debt review. We must urgently conduct a transparent public